Welcome everyone, Costin here with a discussion about Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires, and in this video I want to talk about some of the strongest AI factions that are capable of building an empire around the world, or at least around portions of the world. The reason for this list is not to give you an idea of the challenges that you might face early on in a campaign. It doesn't matter who you start near. You have the possibilities, if you follow the correct plan, you have the possibilities of wiping any faction out. And on top of that, some of the factions that are very dangerous early on in a campaign may not be the ones that can build a global empire. In fact, they might struggle to do so. For instance, if you're fighting against Valkia as Malekith, she is an absolute nightmare. But Valkia has never built, in any of the campaigns that I've played, she has never built a global empire, or she has never taken a significant portion of the map. The factions that I'm going to be talking about in this list are the ones that can and do consistently do that to varying degrees of success. And the purpose of this list is to understand what you may be dealing with throughout the course of a long-term campaign, of a long campaign. Let's say, for instance, you're fighting a campaign as Grand Cafe. Just to give you an idea who you might be dealing with Wolfwan, who you might be dealing with Lustria, and the Empire, just as some examples. That's the purpose of this list, so people can have a good idea of what they might be tackling. Number 5, we have Emperor Karl Franz of the Empire, or Balthazar Gelt. It can be either of them, or even both of them during the course of a campaign that can build some fairly substantial empires. But why is that? Well, the Empire does have a good economy to back them up. They have good choices of troops. They have long-term military potential with things like handgunners, demigriffs, greatswords, and heavy artillery, some of the best in the entire game. And it's really the economy that helps them out, because the weaving house, the Tailor's Guild chain, can provide them a substantial amount of income. But the Empire is one of the weaker factions to actually play yourself. But here's the thing. The Empire, when controlled by the AI, doesn't follow the same set of rules that you do when you're playing them. The AI Empire doesn't have to worry about the Imperial Authority or the Prestige system. They don't have to worry about the limited diplomatic options with the electric counts. They don't have to worry about fealty, getting fealty to a high level in order to confederate other Imperial factions. Nor do they suffer significant penalties when Imperial authority goes low. So as a result of that, the Empire, played by the AI, is significantly stronger. On top of that, Karl Franz in particular, he will start with control of the entirety of the Reichland as well as the fortress of Helmgard. This is very substantial because Helmgard being controlled by him from very early on in a campaign will grant him a significant amount of power, protection from the south, allowing Karl Franz to expand to the north, deal with Festus, and deal with Vlad as well. Vlad is a powerful legendary lord. He's an absolute nightmare to deal early on in a campaign, but I rarely, if ever, see Vlad surviving the swarm of empire that comes towards him, specifically Karl Franz and Balthazar Gelt. Potentially Ungrim as well. And once Vlad is wiped out, once Festus is wiped out, the empire has a lot of territory that it can take and hold and build a very strong economic base. They may not expand too much beyond the borders of the empire, but they will pose any substantial threat for any invader in their lands with powerful armies, numerous armies with some very decent units. Not the best in a campaign, but when you're getting swarmed by multiple stacks of troops, quantity has its own quality after all. And Karl Franz does have benefits in terms of recruit rank, campaign movement range, further recruit rank through his special skill line, though how the AI decides to build him is a different discussion, but you can be almost certain that they'll at least get best of the Empire, and likely Heroic Knightly Band, giving him benefits to captains and lords, increasing their recruit rank. One of the things to say about dealing with AI in general is the best scenario is when you can eliminate their high-ranking lords and they're stuck dealing with low-level lords. Well, Karl Franz in particular can get high-ranking lords from the very start through research and his own skills. He can acquire lords of a certain rank, which obviously gives him an advantage in the mid-late game. The early game, pretty weak, of course. If you want to wipe him out early on in your campaign, you can do so. He's not too much of an issue. But mid to late game, if you show up at the borders of the Empire, you're going to have a fight on your hands. Or Chaos might take over the entirety of the Empire in a campaign, though I've rarely seen that actually happening. In virtually all the campaigns I've fought so far in Immortal Empires, the Empire has survived. It takes something like an endgame crisis to annihilate them, and potentially something like the Lorem endgame crisis combined with the Sylvania endgame crisis, the ultimate endgame crisis, to really put a dent in the Empire, and they might still be able to survive even that. The Empire is a survivor faction, and it's a faction with a good economy, ability to trade, good diplomatic dealings with many of its neighbors, and a fairly versatile roster of units. Now, the AI doesn't fully utilize the Empire's roster to the best of its ability, but it still does a pretty good job with it. Number 4, we have Lord Mazdamundi of the Lizardmen. He is the Lizardmen legendary lord with the hardest campaign start, but the AI doesn't care about it because it's got Dyson spheres producing infinite resources. Well, not infinite, they can run out of money, but they'll certainly run out of money far slower than you do. Keep in mind, this is all considered on legendary. So once Mazdamundi settles the situation here with the Keepers of Bliss and with Skeggi, he is in a pretty great situation. In fact, Mazdamundi consistently manages to take this entire territory, giving him a strong economic base for his own empire. And from there, he probably expands south, taking out the Hunts Marshal, who he absolutely despises. See, the thing about Mazdamundi is not his skills, his faction benefits, or anything like that. It's his position. Having control of this strategic position gives the AI a very powerful starting position. Although the AI will have a lot of enemies, and Mazdamundi can be fairly vulnerable early on in the campaign, but in the late game, it's a different discussion. Morathi might be a problem for Mazdamundi, but Mazdamundi does start with a non-aggression pact with Morathi, and I've rarely seen them come to blows. If they do come to blows, Morathi tends to win that kind of exchange, or rather weakens Mazdamundi so much that factions from the south might come in and finish the job, but then in turn she gets wiped out. But a lot of the times they won't necessarily end up coming to blows. Mazdamundi will take the entirety of the isthmus and then expand further south. And this is where we get into the second issue facing you as a player if you do decide to come to blows with Mazdamundi. Not only will he have a lot of stacks and a lot of territory for you to conquer, but you're not just going to be dealing with Mazdamundi in a lot of campaigns, not on his own. Assuming you have started a campaign outside of Lustre and you've decided to come here in the mid to late game, you're likely going to encounter Itza and the Cult of Sotek as well, and they're all going to be allied. The Lizardmen Alliance of Lustre is a formidable foe. They have a lot of territory, it's good territory, they can produce some fairly high quality troops, and they tend to wipe out all the other factions, even if it takes them dozens of turns, but they do tend to wipe out all other factions relatively easily in this territory. The one who actually has the most durability of the factions outside of Lizardmen ones, the one who has the most durability is actually Rakarth, but even he eventually loses because for all the power the Dark Elves, when controlled by the AI, do have, Rakarth does eventually get overwhelmed by the sheer number of Lizardmen that are going to head his way. And once Lustre is fully controlled by the Lizardmen, it is an insane battleground to actually invade, regardless of who you're playing as. It will require some substantial effort for you to be able to take this territory. So if you do decide to play a campaign as Lustre, your best bet is to strike while they're still weak early on in the campaign, because if you're coming here later on in the campaign, it's going to be a rough ride. I mean, Mazdamundi himself does have a fairly well-defended territory that's not so easy to attack. There's a lot of choke points in the geography from north to south, and even via the sea, there's not so many landing zones as you might assume. So you're going to be funneled into certain choke points. And there's a lot of heavily fortified territories like Skeggi itself that you might need to deal with. At number 3, we have Morathi, the Queen of Nagorond. I'm sure many people who played Warhammer 2 remember her many invasions of Ulthuan, successful invasions of Ulthuan during the course of Immortal Empires. While Morathi is not necessarily as strong in Immortal Empires, she's still one of the biggest threats on the campaign map that you can actually face. It comes down to starting position. You can consider Malekith in the same boat here. He does tend to become very strong, confederate the other Dark Elven factions. And while he does have Valkia as a neighbor, Valkia is going to generally get wiped out by Sigvald or get weakened by Sigvald. But Morathi does have benefits against Malekith, specifically because of the Slaaneshi corruption benefits that it provides on her income. Other benefits as well. She's also quite deadly in battle, and she starts with an amazing starting position, facing off only against a minor faction, or several minor factions. So all the territory that surrounds her, she can take. The only threat she actually faces early on in the campaign is potentially Mazdamundi, though she can make some pretty good diplomatic deals with him. And rarely do I see Mazdamundi and Morathi actually end up coming to blows, and if that happens, she tends to come out on top. The only issue, the only thing that holds Morathi in check is, of course, the swarm of High Elves coming in from Ulthuan, though she can win that fight, though she rarely does so nowadays. Her invasions of Ulthuan are something of a thing of the past, but you gotta consider that she does have all of this territory and no one really to oppose her, with the exception of potentially the Sisters of Twilight, and she tends to win against them if they even come to blows. She doesn't have something like Valkia or Lifanar to press her, and essentially she's just got no major enemy to tackle for much of her early game or mid game. And even those threats that might appear, she is actually stronger than they are. It's also worth mentioning that the AI-controlled Dark Elves are absolutely insane in the sheer number of troops that they can and do produce. I've regularly seen the Dark Elves, even with just 2 provinces, produce 3, maybe even 4 stacks of troops to throw against me. It makes dealing with Hellebron, for instance, as a Lifanar an absolute nightmare, and Morathi is an even worse nightmare than that. If you're playing a High Elven campaign, Morathi is probably going to be the biggest headache you're going to face during the course of that campaign. You can win, absolutely. You do have more number. You can produce more troops eventually, and you do have potentially the entirety of Ulthuan as your economic breadbasket. But even so, Morathi is not an easy fight to have on your hands, and the Slaaneshi corruption will actually benefit her as well. Given the negative effects you're going to be dealing with trying to invade her territory when it's very high on corruption. So Morathi, very dangerous foe, powerful lord in battle, powerful lord on the campaign map. Malekith generally tends to be pretty easy to actually tackle in a one-on-one fight if it comes down to it, though he does have a lot of troops to throw against you. Morathi has a lot of troops to throw against you, and she is far more dangerous than her boy. That's where she is. So number 3 ranking on this list. And number 2, we of course have Grimgor Ironhide. He isn't the best, but he's certainly very close to being the best. The Greenskins are an incredibly powerful race. Good growth, good economy, good control, the WA mechanic giving them substantial military force in every single battle. And Grimgor himself is one of the best combatants of the Greenskins. But that's not why he's so high up on this list. All of those are great benefits, but Azak has great benefits, Grom has great benefits, and yet Grom and Azak tend to do very poorly in their campaigns. That's because they're surrounded by many foes that will just swarm them with raw numbers. Azak tends to lose against Draika and Ungrim, Grom tends to lose against the Bretonnian factions and Athaloran, maybe Elfarian, if Elfarian does decide to hop on a boat just to wipe Grom out, and I'm sure he would actually do that. But when we're thinking about Grimgor, his main advantages, like with others on this list, is his starting position, of course. Start position is a major benefit. The only foe that he actually has that could potentially stop him, and very rarely does, is Kholek. Kholek has a fairly powerful army, but Warriors of Chaos do have limitations on recruitment. The Greenskins have powerful armies, numerous troops, a good economy, and no restrictions whatsoever. Most of the time, Grimgor eats Kholek alive. Very rarely have I seen this not to be the case, and even then Grimgor tends to at least survive, even when his campaign has gone very poorly. But more often than not, if you're not facing Grimgor from early on in the campaign, or hell, even if you're playing any other legendary lord with the exception of Kholek, what Grimgor will do is he will conquer all of this territory in the northern mountains of Morn, build himself a stable base for his empire, take over substantial portions of the Darklands, and then he won't be stopped so easily. He may even conquer the entirety of the mountains of Morn because he is far stronger than Greasus. The only ones who can actually stop him are Emmerich, but Emmerich doesn't have the same kind of military potential that Grimgor does have. Even though Emmerich himself is an incredible beast in actual battles, Emmerich has a lot of issues in his own campaign. The thing about Grimgor is that he doesn't have any major foes, that he's not surrounded by factions that hate them. No one really cares too much about them, one way or another. They're pretty neutral towards him, with the exception of the dwarves. And the dwarves have a lot of things to deal with in their own campaigns. They don't have the time or space to actually deal with Grimgor. And so Grimgor is able to expand across a vast stretch of territory without any significant opposition. Again, I've rarely seen him being wiped out. I've very rarely seen him not manage to create a major empire. And the scary part about Grimgor is he does this quickly. He can take the entirety of the Mountains of Morn within 50 turns with no intervention on your part, because Greasus is just a footnote against Grimgor. Kholek might be an issue early on, but if he deals with that issue, no other faction surrounding him will be able to stop him until Grimgor encounters Emmerich and Cafe. And they'll put up a good, solid fight, but he will eventually overwhelm them with sheer numbers. I mean, the scary thing about Greenskins in general isn't just that they have good armies, or good lords, or good troops, or good economies. It's the Wa mechanic doubling the size of every single stack. When Grimgor declares a Wa on you, you certainly feel it. And he is a major threat to tackle. It isn't pleasant playing a faction like Cafe or the Dwarves or even say Fraught or Chaos, Warriors of Chaos, because with the exception of Kholek, Grimgor is going to be able to grow to become a major pain in your backside. How do you deal with him? It's a tricky situation. There's no simple answer. There's no easy trick to use against Grimgor. You can try and get his armies out of position, but he's always going to have more armies than you. It's just going to come down to a pure war of attrition. You can win that, but you're going to have some heavy battles ahead of you dealing with this guy. Finally, and number one, it is Tyrion of the High Elves. Though really, when you're thinking about Tyrion, you gotta think about all of Wolf One, because when you fight Tyrion in a campaign, you're not just going to be fighting Tyrion, you're also going to be fighting Alariel in the Gaian Vale, and of course Elfarion in Torre of Rest. Tyrion gets alliances very quickly with both of them, especially with Alariel. And both Elfarion and Alariel are fairly strong legendary lords in their own right. And Tyrion is certainly one of the best in the game. Actually, all three of them are some of the best legendary lords in the entire game. He does have a recruitment duration benefit for infantry and cavalry units. He has a strong skill line. He has a diplomatic benefit. And he does have a really good starting province in Etain. But it's not any of that makes Tyrion so powerful. I mean, they contribute, of course, the alliances, the starting position, the benefits of the High Elves. The High Elves have a good army roster from any settlement. They can get spearmen and archers. But one of the things that contributes greatly to Tyrion's strength is the fact that, unlike many other factions of the game, he is not hesitant at all about declaring war on fellow High Elves. I don't think I've played any campaign in Warhammer 3 so far where he didn't conquer Safri, at least, and in quite a few campaigns he may end up in a war with Alarion or Terranok, if not both. And that's a behavior that's really out of place when you think about it. Generally, factions, many races, will not declare war on fellow racial members. So, for instance, an Empire faction will rarely, if ever, declare war on another Empire faction. Even Chaos will rarely declare war on another Chaos faction, or Warriors of Chaos faction will rarely declare war on another Chaos faction. The major exception with that is, of course, Sigvald and Valkia, but it's just that, an exception, it's not the rule. Tyrion has no problems whatsoever. And because of that, because of his willingness to declare war on factions like Safri, Alarion, Calidor, Terranok, he can actually seize a fairly substantial amount of territory for himself. On top of that, Tyrion isn't just a late-game threat. He is a threat throughout the entirety of the campaign. If you're playing Noctilus, Nikari, Morathi, you're going to have a hell of a time dealing with Tyrion. Noctilus is actually the best position to actually wipe him out very early on in his campaign. But even if you manage that, you're still going to have to deal with Alariel and Elfarion during the course of your campaign. And here's another major benefit. The High Elven army is fairly strong. Good units, versatile roster, all that. But beyond that, High Elven settlements are some of the most difficult settlements to take in the entire game. The defenses are formidable, the way the towers are arranged. I've talked a lot in other videos about how to win sieges and how you find a dead zone, and a location where the towers can't hit you. You don't have such a luxury when dealing with High Elven walled settlements. Ulthuan is thus a nightmare to take. Furthermore, and we keep going here, yes, furthermore, the factions that Tyrion has as natural foes, specifically Noctilus and Nikari, early on in the campaign, and then Morathi, well, they're not necessarily the best factions to tackle him. I mean, Morathi is capable of certainly holding her own until eventually she loses to the swarm of foes from Ulthuan, but Noctilus and Nikari are poorly suited to tackle Tyrion. The reason is that Noctilus in particular has very weak units when it comes to out-resolve, because his units have very, very low armor and not necessarily great leadership. Nikari as well doesn't have high armor on their units, and so both Nikari and Noctilus take significant casualties in any auto-resolve situation. Hell, even playing as Noctilus or Nikari on your own is not a pleasant experience when it comes to the conquest of Ulthuan. And once Tyrion, Alarion, and Elfarion have eliminated all the other factions or confederated other factions on Ulthuan, you're dealing with 3 major factions allied together that are going to swarm you with troops if you're playing as, say, Morathi, Malekith, or some other factions. It tends to be a nightmare situation, and Ulthuan is one of the most formidable places in the entire game. It's incredibly difficult to conquer. There's a lot of choke points in the terrain. I believe underways actually don't work in Ulthuan, so you can't just be a Skaven and abuse that situation. And the settlements themselves are heavily fortified, and not only are the units really good when it comes to it, but the walls themselves are quite formidable. On top of that, Tyrion has a really great economy that is one of the most scalable in the entire game, or rather the High Elves do have it. Specifically, their main income structure, the Elven Fairground, not only generates a pretty decent amount of income, but more crucially generates trade resources. And the Elves can certainly benefit from trading with a lot of factions. This is the crux of the issue when it comes to dealing with the Elves, or playing the Elves, actually. Not only are you generating a good amount of income, potentially up to 450 if you have control of 100, and you most certainly can get that, at least in your core territories, but the Elves have scalability when it comes to their economy. They can get even more trade resources with certain heroes or certain lords. And on top of that, they can improve their economy even further with something like an Elven Court or with an Elven Embassy, which gives them income from ports and, crucially, income from trade tariffs. I believe that the Elves may not necessarily have the most amount of money potential in the game. The Greenskins can earn a lot more from sacking settlements, but when it comes to raw income from settlements that they control, I think they have the possibility of gaining some of the highest, if not the highest, in the entire game. And that kind of economic potential is a significant boon to the AI. And then on top of that, you do still have those 3 legendary lords in close proximity with good relations between them. And Alarielle in particular will pose a significant challenge if you do decide to take down Tyrion, because she's most likely going to get the Sword of Cain in her campaign. And even if you might start winning some battles against Tyrion, all it takes is for Alarielle and Elfarion to show up with their own armies, and you're gonna get, well, hammered, so to speak. Alarielle, in her own right, is a formidable foe. Hell, all of the legendary lords of the High Elves are formidable foes. It doesn't matter which one we're talking about. I mean, the weakest of them is actually Teclis. But Lifanar, Tyrion, Elfarion, Emmerich, they're all pretty difficult to deal with on their own. When you add 3 of them together in this area, it's becoming quite a nightmare. In a few campaigns, I've seen Ulf 1 struggle, but even then, I've rarely ever seen all of Ulf 1. In fact, I've never seen all of Ulf 1 being conquered by any other faction, or even an alliance of other factions. So at least one of these guys will survive and then thrive in the late game. And of course, that will pose significant challenges for you if you do decide to take all of Ulf 1 on your own. So yeah, Tyrion gets this number 1 spot because of all of these, and because he is a major threat to deal with from very early on in the campaign, all the way until the end. And there's no endgame crisis that takes place in Ulf 1 to potentially slow him down. In fact, Tyrion is the endgame crisis in Ulf 1. Costin here signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, enable notifications, and I'll see you boys and girls next time.